Alright, so here we have the book matched pair for the back. Now if you'll notice, this set is a little cupped. You can see that right there, which is going to make it a little bit more difficult for the jointing process. So if you're at a tone wood supplier, it would be a good idea to pick through the stacks and find a piece that isn't cupped, such as this one right here. Not that this piece, if you ordered it online, can't be dealt with, but if you have the option, it's always better to pick something straight like that. These are the plates for the top. When you order these through an online supplier, they usually have an outline already drawn on them. In this case, they drew a dreadnought outline simply because that's a very large size guitar, and they grade the back and top plates based on what is within this outline. So if there's some sort of knot or something like that within the outline, the grading would go down. This is Italian red spruce, by the way, and when deciding which end, in this case it's already decided for you because they've drawn out the outline, but if there isn't, in that case, if you didn't have the outline drawn on it, you want to look for the side that has the tightest grain, which would be these inside edges right here, rather than this outside edge where you can see the grain starts to diverge a little bit. So we're going to work on our top first, and the first thing we want to do to this is we're going to erase this outline and put the outline of our guitar that we want to use on this. We're going to use roughly OM orchestra model size mold to trace that outline. Okay, so now we're going to trace out our true outline onto the guitar. We want to line up the center lines of our form here and here with the center line of the two book matched pieces. And you can adjust this forward or towards the top or towards the bottom a little bit to find the best area aesthetically within the frame of the mold. But this looks pretty good to me right here. There aren't any big knots or anything like that. And then I'm just going to take a pencil and trace that out. Here I'm going to show you a simple method for jointing the mating edges of the center seam. Stack the book-matched halves on top of each other so that the center seam edges are exposed on the same side. In other words, imagine the plates as a book and the center seam as the book's binding. Now flip the book closed. The book binding edge can now be planed flat. It is far easier to get a perfect fit by stacking the two pieces and planing them together like this than it is to plane each piece separately. You can use the sole of the hand plane to press them flush. Run your fingertips along the mating edges of the center seam and make sure that they are flush to each other. I find that the best hand plane for this job is the number 5 jack plane. Do not use a block plane for this. The short length of a block plane sole won't allow you to bridge a large enough portion of the working edge to ensure an even, flat cut. Be mindful not to tip the plane as you shoot. To set up the plane, retract the plane's blade all the way into its throat as a starting point, and then advance the blade from the throat slowly until it just barely protrudes from the throat. Using light to moderate pressure, shoot the plane across the full length of the workpiece. If the first pass did not produce any shavings, then advance the plane blade from the throat by a hair and try again until you produce thin, wispy shavings. If your shavings are nearly translucent, then you have found a good setting for your plane blade. Take 3 or 4 full-length passes, maintaining a consistent pressure against the entire length of the center seam. Okay, so after we've taken a couple passes, just enough to make us confident that we've created a new, fresh surface all along the length. Then we can take it out of the clamp and we can check it against the backlight. So I use this backlight that I've installed into my workbench here with a piece of plexiglass over top. But I'll show you other ways to do this as well without having to take up space in your shop like this. Basically the idea is you want a flat surface to rest the plates on with a backlight behind it. This is called a light box. Another way to check your seam is simply to take it up to a window. The window is your flat surface to lay it against, and the natural daylight is your backlight. You can see that we are making contact towards the middle, and we have some light seepage in the upper bout and the lower bout. A third option for candle lighting is to take a piece of glass. In this case, I've removed a window from its sash, and I propped it on 2 chairs. Then just take a light. In this case, I'm using a desk lamp. Place that underneath, so you have your backlight and you have your clear work surface. So you can take your workpiece as before and scrutinize the center seam for light seepage. This is a great option if you're either working in a windowless shop or you're working at night and you don't have the advantage of daylight. Okay, so we place this on the plexiglass of our light box, and we want to check for light seepage along the center seam, of which I can see a lot. It appears that we are making contact right around here, but everywhere else there's a thin line of light. So I'll mark out the area or areas where we need to remove, where it's making contact or is very close to making contact, so we can remove those areas to bring everything in closer together. Now that we've marked off the area to be planed, the area where the 2 pieces were touching, we're going to selectively plane just that area to try and custom fit that seam a little better. So clamp this down as before, line that up as before. I want to pop that out just a little bit. You want the edge to be exposed enough so that your plane blade doesn't run into the backstop. Again, check that so that everything is lined up. And check with your fingernail. Make sure there's not a little lip there. Okay, and then so I have this set to a little bit of a finer cut than it was before, because now we're fine tuning. And I'm not getting any shavings from that, no results. So I'll coarsen that up just a bit. Another pass, coarsen it up a little bit more. There we go. See, now I'm getting something. Let's do one more there. And now just to even it up, I'll do one full pass. Just like that. And let's check it out. Alright, so now we can see that the point of contact is actually moved up here. There's a little bit less light seepage than before. We are contacting in two areas right up in here, which I'll go ahead and mark. Side. So this area right about there, and down here on the end from about there down. So now we can flip this over like that again, and just as we just did a moment ago, we can selectively plane these two. Okay, so you've selectively planed certain areas, you've checked them on the light box, and then selectively planed the areas on the light box where it was touching, and you can't seem to get a tight fit. That's okay. What I like to do, I keep a carpenter's level around with 120 sandpaper, double stick taped to the one side, and 220 sandpaper double stick taped to the other side. Now this can also be an alternative to using the plane. If you don't have a hand plane, maybe it's outside your budget, you could start the jointing process right here and skip the hand plane altogether. It just takes you a little bit longer. It's a little bit easier to use. There's less of a learning curve than using the hand plane. It just takes you a little bit longer and creates a lot of dust in your shop. And my shooting board is a little bit tall for this level, so anytime I switch to using the level, I just stick a thin, this is like an 1/8 of an inch board underneath to raise the level of this plane so that the shooting board or the carpenter's level makes contact with that edge. And then I will just clip this board into place so it doesn't move on me. I'm going to start with the 120 grit edge. I'm just going to sand it like that. So that's an alternative to using the hand plane. If you don't have a hand plane, or you're intimidated by the process of learning to use a hand plane, pretty much anyone can get good results with this. I also use this often after using the hand plane will get me sort of close in the ballpark. It'll bring the light seepage down to a point where I feel comfortable bringing everything in and fine-tuning it with the carpenter's level. So I use a process where I utilize both the hand plane and the sandpaper on the carpenter's level. There is an argument out there, some people will say that a sanded joint is a little bit inferior to a planed joint. In my experience, both joints hold up perfectly fine, so I have no problem finishing up the jointed edge of my tops and backs with sandpaper. So the way we do this is I like to chalk up Okay. So we've chalked up our edge. I'm now going to use the 120 grit side. Chalk allows us to monitor our progress. So I chalk it up, and then I run the carpenter's level with the sandpaper. And you can see we still have a little bit of chalk up here and a little bit of chalk down on the end, because we want to keep going with the 120 grit side until we eliminate all the chalk marks. Once we eliminate all the chalk marks, I'll then switch to the 220 side just to take out the 120 grit sanding scratches, and then we'll check it on the backlight and it should be a good tight fit. Okay, so you've sanded the joint down on the 120 grit side of the carpenter's level until all the pencil marks or chalk marks disappeared, and then you flipped it over to the 220 grit side just to remove the 120 grit scratches and refine the surface. In preparation for gluing, now we're going to unclamp it and check it, and it should be light seepage free now. Okay, so this is what a perfect seam looks like. If I move my head all along this seam, I don't see any light at all. Okay, now we can turn our attention to the book-matched pair of the back plates. And what we want to do is repeat the same process as we did for the soundboard. Everything is the same, except the only thing to consider is that you are now dealing with a hardwood instead of a softwood. All that means is may take a little more time, a little more elbow grease. Okay, so once again I'm going to look for the tightest grain, and that's going to be the inside edge of my book-matched pair. In this case, the grain is relatively tight all the way across, so you can kind of use either edge. Another thing to consider then is that it's going to be easier to joint a book-matched pair that doesn't have converging grain, like you see here. You see how the grain bows outward and then comes in upon itself. What that does is you have inconsistent, and in some areas the grain is running parallel, and in some areas the grain is converging into the line, and the plane is going to cut inconsistently along those lines. It's just going to make it a little bit more difficult. It's not impossible. I'm still going to use this edge anyway and deal with that, just because I really like the look that that creates on our back plate. If you wanted this process to be just a little bit easier and you were worried about not getting a tight-fitting joint, we could use the opposite edge. The opposite edge looks a little bit better. The grain is running more parallel to that center line. You can see, just to see the ideal picture of what straight grained looks like, you can see these grain lines are more or less running straight parallel with the jointed center line. Very rarely are they actually converging into the line. To show you an extreme example of the opposite case, and to show you that it can be done, this is a highly figured piece of mahogany. This is beeswing mahogany, and you can clearly see that the grain is just a mess. It's all over the place. But with careful work, even this can be jointed cleanly. So just like we did with the soundboard, we're going to place this back in the shooting board, clamp it up, make sure everything's pressed in, and then we can begin planing. As with the soundboard, I'm going to plane, check it on the backlight, continue planing, check it on the backlight, see if I can get a perfect edge with the hand plane. If I can't get a perfect seam with the hand plane, I will then refine it with the carpenter's level and sandpaper. Okay, so we finished joining the back plate. As you can see, it's a nice perfect fit, except for we have a little bit of a gap up here, and that's totally fine. I'm going to let that go because that is outside of the outline I've drawn. Anything within that line I would be concerned about, but that I am not. So you've jointed the mating edges of the center seam for the soundboard, and you've jointed the mating edges of the center seam for the back plates. Now we are ready to join the book-matched pairs.